Welcome to Train Signal. This is part 1 of the Protecting Windows 7 lesson in the Windows 7 Administration Training course. In this lesson, we'll cover the networking side of protecting Windows 7, starting with the discussion of network profiles and network location awareness. We'll then move on to Windows 7's powerful built-in firewall and how you manage that firewall for maximum protection. From there, we'll move on to talk about remote desktop and remote assistance, two technologies included in Windows 7 that can aid in troubleshooting and support of Windows 7 PCs. We'll wrap up the lesson by talking about Windows Remote Management Service and its association with PowerShell. Before we get started with the actual lesson, it's important to understand where GlobalMantic is coming from with regard to security in its desktop and overall computing environment. The company is recovering from a serious and very public security incident. As a pharmaceutical company with direct customer contact, GlobalMantic falls under a number of privacy regulations, including HIPAA. The company wants to make sure that every possible reasonable security measure is implemented, including firewalls, carefully configured remote management capabilities, user account control, and various authentication and authorization features. It's vitally important to the company that they don't end up with another security breach behind them. Understanding the security is so important, though, the company understands that usability is just as important. After all, if you secure a system too much, it becomes unusable. So GlobalMantic wants to make sure that we balance security and usability to allow users to do their jobs while the company remains protected. So everything we do in this lesson and in the GlobalMantic Windows 7 rollout plan has to be done with an eye towards usability while securing the environment. Windows 7 includes a concept called network profiles, and it uses a tool called network location awareness to help you take better steps to protect a Windows 7 machine. For example, if you've ever connected to a network with a Windows 7 machine, you'll notice that it asks you a question about what kind of network is this? Is it a home network, or is it a private network in most cases, or is it a public network? Now, when you install to a home or work network, by default, those are considered private networks to Windows 7. So is a domain network, which is only available if you have the system joined to an Active Directory domain. The other type of network is a public network, and this is in a case where Windows 7 takes additional measures to make sure the system stays protected. On a home network, the trusted computers are sitting there. So basically, the other systems that are on a home network are trusted. They are not trusted on a public network. In the case of a home network, the network discovery capability is enabled so you can find other network resources out on the network. And when you connect to a home network, the computer can be a member of a home group. This is a special grouping of machines available in Windows 7 for home users. On a work network, it's very similar to a home network, except the computer cannot be a member of a home group because it's a work computer. Again, with a domain network, a computer cannot be a member of a home group either, nor can it be on a public network. Through the use of network profiles, administrators can set very granular policies that are based on the type of network to which a system is connected. For example, some organizations don't like to use software firewalls because they can get in the way of particular tasks, so they want to disable those software firewalls and allow the network firewall to simply handle all of the protective duties on the network. However, for mobile users that may take their machine to Starbucks and connect to the work network, that's not necessarily a good thing, because if that network firewall is disabled, when that computer goes to Starbucks, it's open to the world. So, you could do something like turn the firewall off when the system is connected to the domain and have it automatically turn back on when the system joins a public network. This is all done via network profiles. Different profiles can be active simultaneously if the system is connected to multiple networks. So let's say that you've got a wireless and a wired network adapter in your computer, and you are sitting in your office and you are connected to the wired network in your organization. That's your domain network, so it's a private network. On that network, there may be no firewall because your administrator has decided that there's going to be no firewall on a private network or a work network. However, the wireless adapter in that laptop is picking up the connection from the Starbucks next door. On that particular connection, administrators have decided that you are going to have the firewall turned on. So in that case, you'd have the different profiles being active simultaneously and the system is connected to multiple networks. I'm now going to go over to a Global Mantis computer that has multiple network adapters in it connected to different networks so that you can see what it looks like when a machine is connected to two different profiles. Here we are at the machine named GM-7-095, and you can see that we have a system here, or a connection here called Local Area Connection that has no internet access, and another one called Local Area Connection 2 that does have internet access. This one has been assigned to a work network, which is by its nature a private network. This one is connected to an unidentified network, therefore it's automatically a public network, considered a public network. The reason it's unidentified is because there's no DHCP server or other network device out there to which it can connect to determine what kind of network it really is. So Windows considers it an unidentified network unless some other information comes in. You can make a change to the network profile for anything except an unidentified network. If you wanted to, you could click Work Network, and you could say this is a home network or a public network instead if you wanted to. And if I change this to a home network, all that would really change is once the process gets done, we'll get back to the Network and Sharing Center, and you'll get to see that it will change it from a private network or a work network to a home network, but it's still a private network. The primary difference, again, between a home and work network is the fact that machines that are work networks cannot use home group. And you can see here that I changed it to a home network. Now I can change it back to a work network. And it will go on its merry way. And when you choose the type of network, you do get a window here that tells you exactly what's allowed and what's not allowed. With a basic understanding of this network profiles business, it's time to talk about Windows Firewall. The Windows Firewall really uses network profiles pretty substantially, so you're going to learn more about profiles as we go through this portion of the lesson. The purpose of the Windows Firewall is to protect computers by disallowing all but specifically allowed network traffic. The Windows Firewall is set to basically deny all. Unless you make other arrangements, all incoming and outgoing traffic in the Windows Firewall is going to be killed. It's not going to go. So in order for traffic to be able to traverse the firewall, you have to create exceptions to the firewall rules. Windows Firewall can block both incoming and outgoing traffic. You probably understand why blocking incoming traffic is important. After all, you want to make sure that unauthorized folks don't get access to your machines. A lot of people don't understand, however, why protecting yourself against outgoing traffic can be just as important. There may come a time when your machine is infested with spyware. A lot of spyware will actually try to open up network connections to outside services to send information to those outside services. Now, although some spyware will disable the firewall or put their own exceptions in the firewall, if you're blocking outgoing traffic, it's less likely that this spyware will be successful. And you will probably be notified that a program is attempting to make use of the firewall in an outgoing way. So the Windows Firewall, by blocking outgoing traffic, can actually be your friend in making sure that your computer stays, if it does get infected, your information does not get sent to the outside world. Now, the network profile that dictates the set of firewall rules that will be applied for that connection. So if you've connected to a public network, there could be one set of firewall rules. If you're connected to a private network, a home or work network, there may be another set of firewall rules. And there could be even a third set of firewall rules for domain-connected computers. Remember, domain-connected computers are generally more trusted than your typical everyday work or home computers, and even much more trusted than public computers. So you may actually relax your firewall settings a little bit for domain-connected computers. I already mentioned that your Windows Firewall blocks anything that's not specifically exempted from being able to communicate to your computer. There are lots of different ways that you can allow new communication to take place through the Windows Firewall. As you add new programs to Windows, they're going to need access to the network. You can allow this access on a per program basis or by directly configuring network ports. We're going to look at a couple of different options here, but I want to do one example in particular to show you exactly how the Windows Firewall works. There are a couple of different ways to actually configure the firewall. There's actually the firewall, and then there's a more advanced technique to configure the firewall and to protect your computer called the Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a rule for ping. Ping stands for Packet Internetwork Groper, and it's a common network troubleshooting tool. A lot of times when you can't access a particular computer, the first thing the help desk will do is to ping that computer to see if it's alive on the network. GlobalMantic does use the ping command, so they want to make sure that there's a rule available in the Windows Firewall so that they are able to ping computers and make sure that they're alive on the network. A lot of organizations even disable even this basic troubleshooting tool because even by knowing that a computer is alive on the network, hackers do have a little bit of additional incentive to go after that computer because it's there and available. GlobalMantic decided that for a balanced perspective between usability and security, ping is going to be allowed. We're going to use the command line method. We're going to use what's called the network shell from the command line, and we're going to add this rule to the Windows Firewall. And what this says is, from the network shell, the advanced firewall rule, we're going to add a rule named ping4. The protocol is ICMPv4, or Internet Control Message Protocol version 4. This is going to be an IPv4, or a regular old everyday TCP/IP rule. You can create an IPv6 version of this rule if you wanted to. Any port for ICMP. Direction in. So we're going to say incoming ping requests are going to be allowed. Now this could be out if I wanted to, but ping is already allowed to go out, so it doesn't really matter. So action could be allow, action could also be deny, but in this case we want to actually allow the action to take place. I'm now going to go over to the computer name GM-WAIK. We used that earlier in this course when we talked about deploying Windows, and we're going to ping the computer name GM-7-075, and we're going to see what happens. Here we are on the machine named GM-WAIK, and we're going to ping GM-7-075. And you're going to see that that machine is basically inaccessible. When you use the ping command and you get this, that means that the machine was not accessible via the ping command. You can't automatically assume that the machine is down, however, because it could be up, and it just happens to be that its firewall is blocking the ping request. Well, that's probably the case here, so let's go check. So we'll open up the control panel, and we'll see if the Windows Firewall is enabled. We'll go to Windows Firewall, and you can see that the Windows Firewall state for the domain network, which is connected, is on, and it's going to block all connections to programs that are not on the list of allowed programs. Notification state is set to notify you when Windows Firewall blocks a new program. We'll talk about notifications shortly. Now, if I want to add this rule from the command line, I have to do so from an elevated command prompt. So I'm going to go to the command prompt, right-click it, and choose Run as Administrator. So, the command that I'm going to type is netsh adv firewall, that's the advanced firewall rule, add rule name equals ping4, so that I know this is for IPv4. This is basically going to allow all ICMP traffic. Ping is part of ICMP, or Internet Control Message Protocol. Protocol equals ICMP v4 colon any port. Direction equals in, action equals allow. And you just get a simple message back that says OK. Now I'm going to go back over to the WAIK machine and execute that same command. As soon as I enabled that firewall rule, you'll notice that I'm now getting a reply from 192.168.0.187, which is the IP address for GM7075. So the only problem with the ping command here was that the firewall was disallowing the ping command from making its way to the system so the system could respond. That's pretty cool. So you got to see in action, basically, the firewall, once a new rule was applied, being able to allow that particular traffic to come through the system. You can also add new rules from the GUI. If I go to allowing programs or features to the firewall here now, you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of allowed programs and features. Right now, core networking is allowed. Ping 4 is allowed. I just created this rule, and you'll notice that it's allowed for the domain, homework, and public. Remote assistance is allowed by default. And that's about it. I'm going to do something here. I'm going to disable the domain portion of this, and I want you to see what happens. So I've just disallowed it for the domain. Go back over to WAIK. And once again, you're able to see that the machine is no longer accessible. So that proves to you that that rule is actually working, and that's the rule that is in place for ping. I'm going to go back down and allow that rule again. Oops. If you wanted to allow another program through the firewall, basically you've got remote desktop, you've got a whole bunch of other tools here that you may want to use. But if you want to allow another program, all you've got to do is click the allow another program or allow the button here on the screen and choose the program that you want to allow full access through the firewall. Well, I'm just going to choose one here because we're not going to really be able to test it very easily. We'll just do Internet Explorer. And you'll see the Internet Explorer is now completely allowed through the firewall. It really was before because it's part of core networking. But this allows anything Internet Explorer tries to do to go out through the firewall. Now, there's a danger in this as well. But a program that's allowed through the firewall in this method is allowed to do anything that it wants. So what that means is I've just allowed Internet Explorer. By allowing Internet Explorer in this method, it can do whatever it wants going out through the firewall. If you allow it on a port basis, like I did by allowing ICMP traffic for the ping command, you're limiting a little bit what that program is allowed to do or what that service is allowed to do. So before you decide to just open up an entire program to the outside world, make sure that that's the right thing to do. In a lot of cases it is, but if you're just trying to have one subset of that program be able to do something, see if it's better to use a TCP or UDP port instead. And read up on those TCP and UDP port things because they're pretty important as you start working with the firewall more and more. Notice when I click the Network Location Types button, you're able to edit the program here as well. You can say you want to allow this rule for the domain network, private networks, or public networks. And these are just the network profiles we discussed earlier in this lesson. Now you just got to see me create a rule using the command line and a little bit of an exposure to the GUI method. I'm going to give you a little more exposure to the GUI method now by going and replicating this exception at the graphical user interface rather than using the command line. I've also reset the Windows firewall on my machine to the defaults, so this rule no longer exists, so we can create it again. So let me show you how I got here. I am now at the Windows Firewall console from the control panel, and you saw this screen just a minute ago. I'm now going to the Advanced Settings option. And this is the Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. It's a much more powerful configuration mechanism than the screen you just saw. This screen allows you to make extremely granular decisions with regard to the Windows Firewall. So, we're going to do that now. A couple things I want you to notice before we get started. This is going to tell you a little bit more about what's actually allowed and not allowed with regard to each profile. So the Windows Firewall is on for each profile. You can enable and disable the Windows Firewall on a per profile basis. To do that, you go to the Windows Firewall properties from here, and you notice that there are some tabs across the top that will allow you to make decisions about how you want to configure that firewall. And we'll talk about those more soon, but I wanted you to see them before we get started. I'm going to create a new inbound rule that we just discussed that's going to allow ping to work. So I'm going to right-click inbound rule and choose new rule. I'm going to create a custom rule for all programs. The protocol type is going to be ICMP v4. And I'm just going to, I'll click customize so you can see what this allows. But I'm going to allow all ICMP to work. I'm not going to try to break down to specific ICMP types, but these are the different things you can do. We're actually doing what's called an echo request, and that's what ping does. But if I wanted to be very granular, I could say I only want to allow echo requests and not any of this other stuff. Next. Which local IP addresses does this rule apply to? Well, I could decide that I want to apply it to just a particular range or a particular IP address, but I'm going to allow it for any IP address. And which remote IP addresses does this rule apply to? This is where I could actually say only the machines with the following IP addresses are allowed to ping this computer. Well, in the interest of simplicity, I'm just going to choose any here. But if I wanted to, I could add IP addresses here, and that way I could actually, let's say I have a management machine on the network, which GlobalMantics right now does not have a full up management machine. I could set the address of that management machine here so that only that machine was allowed to ping this computer, and that would actually provide an additional level of security over just allowing anything to ping the machine. And we're going to allow the connection. You'll notice here that there's different actions. We can allow the connection. We can allow the connection if it's secure, which means it's been authenticated using what's called IPsec or IP security. We're not going to be talking about IPsec in this lesson. Or I can simply block the connection. I don't want to block it, I want to allow it. Now, to which profiles does this rule apply? Domain, private, or public? The name is going to be ping4, and I'm going to call it ping4 GUI just so we can see it being different. And now, when I go down the list here, we'll see a ping4 GUI. And it's enabled for all of these different network types. Now I'm going to go back over to the other machine. I'm going to ping this machine and make sure that it works. And indeed it does. So the machine was able to ping this, the machine we just configured, and you're able to see that creating rules from both the command line and the GUI is a relatively easy process, although I will admit you'll probably see that the GUI method was much easier. There are a couple of other things that are important to know. The first one is configuring firewall notifications, which can be done so on a per profile basis. A firewall notification is exactly what it sounds like. It's a notification that something took place with the Windows firewall. Basically, that a rule blocked something, that a program that's not authorized to make a connection through the firewall try to do so, whatever. You can configure these notifications on a per profile basis, and we'll go do that in just a minute. You also need to understand how to reset the Windows firewall to its default factory settings. I've had to do this before because I screwed the firewall up so bad that I couldn't repair it. And that's easy to do when you start creating granular rules in the Windows firewall. There's a couple of different ways you can do this. One is from the GUI, and the second is from the command line. From the GUI, you can click the Restore Defaults in the Windows Firewall Control Panel applet. There's a button on the left-hand side of the screen, or a link, that'll allow you to restore the defaults. Or from the command line, you can use the netsh adv firewall reset command to reset the Windows firewall to its default state. And this basically removes all of the custom rules and everything that you've created so far with the Windows firewall. I'm now going to go back over to the machine we've been using for these examples, and I'm going to show you a little bit more around the Windows firewall and how to look at notifications on a per profile basis and a few other things. And then I'm going to show you how to reset the Windows firewall to its defaults. And you can see we're on GM7075 again. And I'll go to Start Control Panel. And you'll see the Windows Firewall option. This is what we've already seen. You've got to see this a little bit and some information about how Firewall is working with your computer. And although we're not even connected to these other profiles right now, I wanted you to see that basically from the front page of the Firewall tool, you're going to get to see quite a bit of information here. The first option is to change notification settings. And that was what you saw right over here at the left-hand side of the screen. There's basically a little menu of options here to help you make different firewall configuration changes. So I'll choose Change Notification Settings. And you'll notice that I can customize settings for each type of network here. So right now, for the domain network, I've got the Windows Firewall turned on. And I can, at this point, if I wanted to, I could block all incoming connections, even those that are on the list of allowed programs. So basically, if I did that, nothing gets through, even if it's allowed. So if I were to enable that and then go back and try to ping this machine, I wouldn't be able to because that traffic would not be allowed to this machine. If Windows Firewall happens to block a new program for some reason, I'll be notified down on the system tray. And you get the same options for both the private and the public networks as well. From here, you can also turn the Windows Firewall off completely for a particular profile. So if I turned off the Windows Firewall for the private network, you're going to notice that when I come back to the Windows Firewall Control Panel applet, I've got a little red bar here saying that there's a problem. Well, the problem is that there's no firewall turned on for a private network location. And so it's telling you that that's a red situation that you really should fix. So if I wanted to fix that, I can use the recommended settings button and go back to having the firewall enabled for all three profiles. And clicking the Turn Windows Firewall on and off takes you to the same screen we just saw. So changing notification settings and turning the Windows Firewall on or off take you to the same screen. I'm going to skip this for now, we'll come back to it. The Advanced Settings page is where we were before to create some granular rules. From here, you can see some additional information that we didn't get to see before in the other firewall tool, including some monitoring information. For example, choosing the Firewall Monitoring tool tells you what's going on right now as far as what's allowed through the firewall. This is a good way to see very quickly what's actually being allowed rather than trying to run through a whole bunch of rules. There's some other things that we're not using, we will not be using in this lesson, but understand that there's a whole lot of security options that can be used in the Windows Firewall. Here's some outbound rules that are already configured. There's core networking. There's network discovery. In fact, I'm going to sort by enabled so we can see the rules. So basically, when you look at some of the core networking rules, if you don't allow DNS to work, when you try to use Internet Explorer, it will not be able to go out on the network and try to look up IP addresses based on a domain name. So you want to make sure that you allow these core networking rules to stay active. Core networking is pretty important. You can also import and export policies. So let's say you've created a whole bunch of rules on one machine. You can move them to another machine by exporting your policies to a file and then importing that policy on another machine so you don't have to recreate these rules on every machine in your organization. Now, what happens if you decide you want to reset all of your firewall rules? Well, that's where you go to the Restore Defaults option. And when you click the Restore Defaults option, you get a button that says this is going to remove all the firewall rules that you've configured for all network locations, and it may cause some things to stop working. Well, when you click Restore Defaults, it's going to tell you again, hey, do you really want to do this? And you have to say yes. And at that point, you'll notice that Ping 4 is gone, for example, because it was a rule we created, and it's no longer available because we've disabled or we've removed all of the rules we created by resetting the Windows Firewall. Remote Desktop allows a user to connect to your local desktop from a remote computer and operate it as if he were sitting at the console. You've seen Remote Desktop used a lot in this course already. Every time I go over here, I have a Remote Desktop connection to the server named Hyper-V1, and that's how I'm managing all of my remote machines. Remote Desktop is very commonly used by IT staff to manage servers and to connect to user machines to be able to do work, even doing things like updates or troubleshooting and things like that. In order to work, however, remote desktop must be explicitly enabled. The default setting for remote desktop is to not allow remote connections to the machine. And this is a good thing. You really don't want remote connections enabled unless you know you're going to use them, because that's just another vector by which a nefarious fiend of the underworld could connect to that machine or try to connect to that machine to take it over and do something bad. There are a couple of different options for allowing remote desktop to work. You can allow connections from computers running any version of remote desktop. So basically, if you have a Windows 98 machine or a Windows 2000 machine and it has remote desktop tool installed, you'll be able to connect to a Windows 7 machine using that tool. Or you can allow connections only from clients that are running a remote desktop client with network level authentication. This includes Windows XP with Service Pack 3, Windows Vista, and Windows 7 desktops, including Windows and also Windows Server 2008 and those other server-based operating systems that also have a remote desktop client. This is a much more secure way for Windows to be able to work. Basically, network level authentication adds an additional layer of security to a remote desktop connection that wasn't available in the past. So whenever possible, you should allow connections only from clients that are running remote desktop with network level authentication. Even when you enable remote desktop, you still have to specifically identify which users are allowed to connect remotely. When you enable remote desktop, it doesn't just provide carte blanche access to anyone in the organization to connect to that desktop. Instead, you have to specify a list of users that is allowed to connect to that remote desktop machine. Let's go over and enable remote desktop on one of the systems we've been using for this course. So I'm over here on GM7075. Now you may wonder how I'm able to get to this desktop with remote desktop if remote desktop is not enabled on this machine. I'm running this machine under Windows Hyper-V, which is Microsoft's virtualization platform, and that uses a different method to connect to these machines, which also uses a remote desktop-like protocol. However, it's not the same remote desktop that we're talking about in this lesson. So to enable remote desktop, go to the Start menu, right-click Computer, and choose Properties. From the Properties page, choose the Remote Settings option. And down here, you're going to see a number of remote desktop options. The first one, which is the default, that says Don't allow connections to this computer. And then the second one is allowing connections from any version of remote desktop. And the third is allowing connections from remote desktop clients that have network level authentication. I'm going to just choose the second one for now, and I'll click this Select Users button. You're going to see that the users listed below can connect to this computer, and any members of the administrators group can connect even if they're not listed. That's important. When you enable remote desktop, if you want to enable it for your domain admin staff, for example, the list of people who are in your domain administrators group in Active Directory, you don't actually have to do much. By default, the administrator account, the local administrator account, already has access to the remote desktop for the local machine. And as you can see here, it tells me that GM administrator, the Global Mantix local administrator account, or the Global Mantix domain administrator account already has access to this machine. So I'll click OK and apply. Now, if I wanted to, I could remote into GM7075, or I could remote in via IP address. I'll make sure I know this machine's IP address. 192.168.0.187. And let's see what happens. Didn't work by name, so we'll try it by IP address. And you'll see that it did work this time. Click OK. Now, it's telling me that the identity of the remote computer cannot be verified. Do I want to remotely connect anyway? Yeah, the certificate name for this one is GM7075, but I'm connecting via its IP address. I'm going to say I don't want to see this again because it doesn't really matter. I know I'm connecting to this machine. But if you get this a lot and you're not sure you're connecting to the right computer, make sure that you can verify the computer to which you're connecting, because you may be suffering from someone redirecting your connection to a computer that you don't want to connect to, or something else. So make sure that you are actually connecting to the computer you're intending to connect to, just to be on the safe side. And we're at the same screen we just were, but this time it says 192.168.0.187, and we're connected directly now. And remote desktop is enabled because we logged in as the user with the administrator context. So we just remotely connected to this machine, and here we are. There are a number of options that come with remote desktop. What you just saw was a remote session can be established that assumes control of an existing session. The virtualization server, Hyper-V, that I'm using already had a remote desktop session established to the machine to which I connected. Therefore, I basically assumed control of that remote desktop session rather than a new one being created. If I had no connection already established, a new session would be established to the remote desktop machine. Or I could log in as a different user. So right now I logged in as administrator, but I could log in as any other user if I wanted to, as long as that user had been allowed to use remote desktop. However, doing so results in a dialog box asking permission, since the currently logged in user will end up being logged off. Now let's test this. I'm going to go configure remote desktop to allow another user access to the desktop remotely. And then I'm going to try to log in as that user while I'm already logged in via a remote desktop connection so we can see what happens. So I'm back over here on GM7075, and I'm going to go to Start and right-click Computer, the computer name, choose Properties, go to Remote Settings, select Users, and I'm going to add the username Scott. So you can see GM Scott's been added. Now, I'm going to go back over to my other machine. I'm going to start a new remote desktop connection. The first thing I see is another user's already logged in. If I continue, the user has to disconnect. Do I want to continue? Yeah, I do. Please wait for the administrator to respond. So I'm going to go back over to that other machine. And you're going to see that it says, hey, somebody else wants to connect. Is that okay? Click OK to connect your session to disconnect now. Otherwise, you'll be disconnected in 30 seconds. Now, if I canceled it, which I did, it basically denies that person access. I'm told that this administrator denied my disconnect request. Now notice, if I had been away from my machine, I would have gotten kicked off because it's going to say you'll be automatically disconnected in 30 seconds. However, I was there, so I was able to cancel the request, and it says GM administrator denied your disconnect request. So let's try it again. This time I'm going to allow it. And we'll go OK. And again, I'm going to get the same message. Do you really want to do this to the guy? So I'll say yes. Minimize. Go back over to the other session. And this time I'm going to say OK. Now this time I got logged off over here. So on the machine, I was working on this machine as administrator, but I was logged off. And when we come back over here to the other session, we get the preparing your desktop message and all the stuff that goes into creating a new desktop on Windows 7. And eventually we'll get to the Windows 7 desktop, and there we go. And this time I'm logged in as the other user. So that's how some of the different modes of remote desktop work. Remote assistance is sort of like remote desktop, except different too. Whereas remote desktop has to be explicitly enabled, and then someone has to proactively connect to that desktop, so it's established from the remote side of the equation. Remote assistance is enabled by default, and it's initiated by the user of the machine. Now, it's commonly used by users to get help from tech support. So you'll call the help desk, and you'll say, okay, let me use remote assistance. I'll turn on remote assistance, but I need help with this. Then the user will then basically allow the help desk person access to their machine via remote assistance, so that they are able to get the help that they need. Remote assistance uses a time-limited invitation, default is 6 hours, that allows a remote user access to the desktop. You can create secure invitations as well, but then only users that are using Windows Vista or Windows 7 can actually respond to those invitations. Remote assistance is configured from the same place we configured remote desktop. And I'll show you that right now. We got to log back into the desktop. You'll notice that both of these users are still logged in. So basically, administrator didn't actually get logged off. They just got disconnected. But they're both logged on. So that's actually pretty cool. So we'll log back in as administrator. Go to full screen. Go to the Start menu. Right-click the computer name. Properties. Remote settings. Again, notice that remote assistance is enabled by default. And when you click the Advanced tab, remote control says allow this computer to be controlled remotely and set the maximum amount of time that an invitation stays active. So you can have it set for minutes, hours, or days. And you can have it set for a whole lot if you wanted to. The default is 6 hours. And again, you can then create invitations that can only be used from computers that are running Windows Vista or later. It's slightly more secure, and we're going to do that because GlobalMantic is very paranoid about remote desktop security, so they want to make sure that these invitations are secure, particularly since they're going to be used by non-IT personnel. For GlobalMantic with remote desktop, they want to make sure that IT personnel can connect to desktops regardless of what client they're using. But the IT personnel understand the security implications of using remote desktop. They're not certain that all of the users will understand the implications of using remote assistance, so they're creating invitations that are a bit more secure just to be on the safe side. And that's how you configure remote assistance. There's really not a whole lot to it. The next step of the process is actually requesting that remote assistance. So I'm going to go back over to the machine now, and we're going to request remote assistance while we're logged into GM7075, and we'll have the user on GM-WAIK respond to the remote assistance request. So we're on GM7075. We'll go to Start, All Programs, Maintenance, Help and Support. Click More Support Options. And you're going to see here that we have Windows Remote Assistance. So I'll click to open Windows Remote Assistance, and I'm going to invite someone that I trust to help me. So I'll click that button. And I'm going to get some options on how to get this remote assistance. I can save the invitation as a file, or I can email the invitation if I'm using Outlook or something, or I can use what's called Easy Connect. Now, I'm not sure Easy Connect will always be available, so I'm going to save the invitation to a file since I don't have an email server set up for GlobalMantic yet. I'm going to save this invitation on the server name GM file in the Shared Docs folder. And here's the password we need to use. So I'm going to save this too so that I don't lose it when I go over to the other machine. Now, again, this is assuming that you're on the phone with the person while they're connecting. So you'd actually give them this password while they're sitting on the phone with you. Now I'm going to go over to GM7 or GM-WAIK. I'll go to All Programs. You can also type Remote in the search box, and you'll see Windows Remote Assistance come right up. I'm going to help someone that's invited me. I'm going to use an invitation file. The invitation file I saved at GM file, Shared Docs, Invitation. And what's the password? Well, I don't remember it, so I'm going to go get it. Shared Docs, password. And I'll just copy and paste the password into, there we go. And I'll click OK. Now I've got a window here and it's going to say waiting for acceptance. So I'm going to go back over to the other machine, and it's going to say, do I want to allow administrator to connect to my computer? After connecting, this person is going to be able to see whatever it is on your desktop. So make sure you've closed all your personal stuff and click yes. Your helper can now see your desktop. Let's go over to the helper machine. And you'll see it's a little bit squashed. That's because it's trying to get the same amount of desktop in a smaller space. And you'll notice I can't actually do anything. I can't click the start button. I can see things, but I can't do anything. Well, what this is because I'm in sort of a shadow mode right now. I'm not able to actually do anything, but I can watch the user do stuff. So if the user does something, I'm always able to see it, and then I can talk them through a process. If it's something that I really need to do because it's getting a little bit too complex or something, I can click Request Control, and you're going to see I get a button here that says, would you like to allow administrator to share control of your desktop? Well, I can't click yes from here, so I've got to go over to the other machine and answer in the affirmative. Yes. Your helper is now sharing control of your desktop. And now, as I move around, I'm able to actually manipulate the computer if I need to. And there are some settings that you can do. You can save a log of the session. You can exchange contact information when you're using EasyConnect. If you want to save a log, I'm not going to do any of this, but you can do. There's lots of things you can do. So by using these settings, I'm able to do different things. I can also chat with the person. And it's going to open up a chat window over here. And I'll get the note back. So you're able to see that remote assistance actually does work, and you can have a chat session. Now, if you're on the phone, probably a chat session is really not that important. But if you've established this session via email and it's taken someone a couple hours to get back to you, you may not be on the phone anymore. So this chat thing can be pretty nice if you're trying to do something. Windows 7 also includes a complete remote management service called WinRM. WinRM enables command line and PowerShell-based management for remote systems. This allows you to almost completely control remote systems from scripting from a command line tool or from PowerShell. This means that you can script events that take place whenever you really want to by using command line or PowerShell. This does require that the WinRM service first be configured on the remote system. By default, WinRM is not configured. And that's a good thing. Again, by default, many things are disabled in Windows 7, and they have to be explicitly enabled for you to use them. This is by design, and this is a good security practice. This is sort of the principle of least access, or, this reduces the surface area for the machine to be attacked. If the WinRM service was automatically enabled all the time, hackers would know that, and they would be able to go after the machines much more easily. But by default, these things are disabled, and you have to actually enable them. With a remote management service, you do this from a command line that has to be given administrator privileges. By using the command winrm quick config. This starts the WinRM service and sets it to start automatically on subsequent reboots. This creates what's called a WinRM listener to allow incoming WinRM connections to be serviced. Basically, it establishes a process on the Windows 7 machine that does nothing but listen for new incoming remote management connections. It also creates a WinRM exception in the firewall. If you don't do that, then remote systems cannot connect to this Windows system for WinRM purposes. I'm going to go over to one of our machines we've been working on, and I'm going to run WinRM quick config. Here we are on GMWAIK. I'm going to go to Start, All Programs, Accessories, right-click Command Prompt, and choose Run as Administrator. I'm going to do WinRM quick config. And this is going to start a script. It's going to tell me that WinRM is not set up to receive requests on this machine, and the following changes must be made. Set the WinRM service type to Delayed Auto Start. Do I want to do this? Yes, I do. WinRM has now been updated to receive these requests, and the service type has been changed successfully, and the service has been started. However, it's not set up yet with a firewall exception. We have to do two things: create a WinRM listener to accept WS management requests of any IP on this machine, and enable the WinRM firewall exception. Do we want to do this? Yeah, we want to do this. And you can see now that this stuff has taken place. It created that WinRM listener, and it created a firewall exception for WinRM. And we can go see that. Windows Remote Management. You'll also notice, oh, you can't actually. It was gray. It was changed. So it's there. Let's cancel. This is a good thing. All we've done at this point is configure the machine to be able to accept incoming WinRM connections. We haven't told it from where it's allowed to accept those connections. If the systems are in the same domain, then you don't have to do anything else. You can actually start using WinRM right away. If, however, those systems are not in the same domain, you have to take some additional steps. You basically have to establish what are called trusted hosts, and this is absolutely necessary if you want to manage remotely via PowerShell for a machine that's outside the domain. So this is the command you would use to do that. We don't have to do that in this course because all of our machines are part of the Global Mantix domain. WinRM, set WinRM, config client, @ and then a list of trusted hosts inside the exclamation points, or the whatever these are called. I can't remember tonight. I must be getting old. Or you can do it via group policy at computer configuration, administrative templates, Windows components, remote Windows management. Now what we're going to do is I've enabled the WinRM service on GM7075 as well as GMWAIK. I want to show you what happens when I try to execute the directory command using the WinRS, which is the Windows Remote Shell command. That's the kind of the sidekick for Windows Remote Management against GM7075. And I'm going to do this from GM7WAIK. So I'm going to do WinRS -R. This is going to be the remote machine. dir. And you'll see the volume in drive C is GM7075-drive C. I actually changed the volume name on GM7075 so you would see that we're actually getting a directory listing from there. If I do a directory listing here, the volume in drive C has no label. That's because when I just type dir, I'm getting a directory listing from GMWAIK. But scrolling up a little bit, here we go. GM7075. Now, the other thing I can do an IP config. So, if I do an IP config /all, that gives me a lot more information. So, I did an IP config /all using the WinRS the remote machine GM7075. I'm on GMWAIK. The host name is GM7075. That proves that I'm actually getting this information from GM7075. So I don't actually have to remote into that machine to get this information. I can actually just use the WinRS command, assuming I've enabled Windows Remote Management on that machine, and be able to execute pretty much any command that I want against that remote machine. You can probably see why only machines that are in the domain are allowed to be trusted with this kind of access. This could be pretty dangerous in the wrong hands. And I'm also logged in as administrator, and so all of my commands are being run in the administrator context. If I was logged in as a user with less rights, I wouldn't be able to do a lot of this stuff. So it's very user specific, and it's also only been allowed to be done with machines that are trusted, and that's an important thing because this in the wrong hands could be a disaster. But in the right hands, this can be a pretty powerful tool for remote management. You can also do remote management via PowerShell. This requires that you enable WinRM as we previously discussed. That's with WinRM Quick Config. You must also be using PowerShell version 2. PowerShell version 1 won't work. That's the default in Windows 7. And you have to use the ICM. This is an alias for the invoke commandlet in PowerShell to run a command on a different machine. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to get some information, the computer name specifically, using PowerShell from GM7075, using PowerShell from GMWAIK. Let's go over and do that. I'm going to close the command prompt. Go to Start. Right-click PowerShell. I type PowerShell here and run as administrator. I use the search box a lot, so I don't always know where everything is on the Start menu these days. And I'm going to type the command ICM GM-7-075 get-WM object. This is just a PowerShell command. -class Win32_computer system. That's because the command is get-WMI object, Windows Management Instrumentation. So when I type that, the right thing happens. So the domain is GlobalManTix. Manufacturer of this computer is Microsoft. It's a virtual machine named GM7075. Prior owner's name is Scott. Physical RAM is 1 gig, and the computer name again is GM7075. So you're able to see that. Again, if I just ran this command here without using the ICM command, I would actually get information from the local machine. This machine is actually named GM7100. I just am calling it GMWAIK for my own purposes. So, by using the ICM command or the invoke command against a different machine, I'm able to actually run a PowerShell command on that other machine. From a scripting capabilities perspective, this is incredibly powerful. You can do pretty much anything you want on any machine as if you're running it locally. This is good stuff. In part 1 of the Protecting Windows 7 lesson, we covered the networking components in Windows 7 and how they can be associated with security. We began the lesson talking about network profiles and network location awareness, and then we talked about the Windows firewall that's included in Windows 7. Remote Desktop and Remote Assistance were next up on the menu, and you learned how to configure these two tools in ways to help IT support users in the organization. Windows Remote Management Service, or WinRM, and PowerShell are also powerful remote management tools that are built into Windows 7, and we discussed their use and how to enable those tools in Windows 7. This is a supporting resource that has to do with everything you've ever wanted to know about the Windows firewall that's included in Windows 7. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.